The Abyss, La Signora, Tartaglia, Scaramouche, Azar and the Sages, Dottore, Rerir, and the Heavenly Principles. These are all characters who have played the main role of being a main antagonist in Genshin Impact over the last 6 years. Now, you might be already saying in the comment section, Gil, you said the word antagonist there, not villain. Isn't it one and the same? And if so, why didn't you use the word villain, since that's the main topic of this video, right? Well, that's because it isn't one and the same. An antagonist isn't necessarily always a villain. An antagonist can be somebody who can be good. It can be somebody who's morally gray, or somebody who's an anti-hero. It can be a plethora of things, of course, including a villain. Now, in this list, I've actually listed a character who I personally wouldn't constitute as a villain. And because of that, I want to go over first and foremost what a villain is, and for that I'm actually going to read the definition of what a villain is using the Merriam-Webster dictionary and Cambridge dictionary. I've got two dictionaries here because I wanted to make sure that you guys got the point as to what a villain is, because I feel like not only just the Genshin Impact community, but especially the Genshin Impact community, I feel generally communities across various franchises tend to conflate and confuse villains and antagonists, right? So let's go over the definition of what a villain is first and foremost, using the Merriam-Webster dictionary first. A villain, according to Merriam-Webster, is a character in a story or play who opposes the hero, or a deliberate scoundrel or criminal, or one blamed for a particular evil or difficulty. Okay, very straightforward there. Now let's move on to Cambridge. According to them, a villain is a bad person who harms other people or breaks the law, or a criminal, or a character in a book, play, film, game, etc. who harms other people, or something or someone considered harmful or dangerous. Okay, two very similar definitions of what a villain is. Now, if you take a look at the list that I just had up a second ago, right? You look at all of them. 8 characters who have played the role of an antagonist over the last 8 years. Who would I constitute as not a villain? Well, the answer is very simple and very straightforward. It's Tartaglia. Tartaglia isn't a villain, in my personal opinion. While yes, you could say that he fulfills two potential definitions of what a villain is, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary in particular: a character who opposes the hero, or somebody who can be blamed for a particular difficulty in this situation. I would say it's hard-pressed to say that, well, he was blamed for the entire situation in leeway, first and foremost. I think it's a bit harsh to say that, considering, you know, Signora also had her role to play, and then you also had all the other stuff going on, right, in leeway that didn't really amount to, you know, Tartaglia being at fault necessarily. And similarly, when it came to opposing us as the hero, yes, he did oppose us, but if you look at the immediate before and immediate afterwards, it felt like we were buddy-buddy immediately, you know, in those situations. So I would say it's kind of hard to say that Tartaglia fulfills any of these definitions. And so for me personally, I would say I would be hard pressed to find him as a villain, but definitely I would say yes, he was an antagonist, maybe a morally gray antagonist at most, you know. So you remove Tartaglia from the list of villains I've said. That's 7 villains still left on this list. So, and I would say that first and foremost, before we go any further, that I believe and I can be assured to say that these villains that I've listed have at least committed or are defined correctly so by at least 2 of these definitions that I've just listed, you know, a few moments ago. If you look at both Merriam-Webster's dictionary and Cambridge's dictionary, I would say all 7 of these have fulfilled at least 2, if not more, of these definitions for sure. So now we move on to the main topic at hand. Does Genshin Impact have a villain problem? Now, let's do it by the numbers first, right? 7 villains I've listed over the last 6 years, and that's only the main Archon quest, by the way. You could add many more villains as well, potentially, right? From the various world quests, story quests, events, yada yada yada. You could add way more. And I think there's one in particular that I wanted to mention, of course, that I haven't added to this list, and that is, of course, Rene of the Narcisen Cruz Ordo, right? His actions and his experimentations. Rene could easily fulfill 2, if not more, of these definitions, and he could easily place himself on this list of villains very easily, right? However, I wanted this video to focus in on the main Archon quest, and I want to focus on the villains that appear primarily in the main Archon quest, because not everybody experiences the world quest, not everybody experiences the story quests or the events, right? So their main source of Genshin villains is through the main Archon quest, and for that reason this video will particularly focus on those villains. Now let's go over the topic at hand, right? The main topic, the topic that you guys are here for. Does Genshin Impact have a villain problem? And if you look at it from a mathematical perspective, first and foremost, right? And it's a very easy mathematical process, right? 7 villains in 6 years. That's more than a villain a year, right? So automatically you'd say that, well, they don't really seem to have a villain problem, right? 7 villains in 6 years, that's pretty good, right? I think that it's unfair to say that and, dismiss the topic at hand so easily, because that's not everything when it comes to, having a villain problem, right? Because a villain problem could be more than just having a lack of villains. It could be that the villains are not good enough, the villains are not explored enough, and so on and so forth, right? Now, if you were to talk about this topic a few years ago, back in Fontaine, I think a majority of people would say 100%. Yeah, absolutely, Genshin does have a villain problem, right? But I think since Fontaine, with Natlan putting more of a focus on the Abyss, and then of course in Nordcry, we had some amazing villains in Reverie and Dottore. Yes, that they've done a great job with those two, right? I think right now there is still a slight villain problem in Genshin Impact. And I'm taking my time in phrasing this because I don't want to, make this seem like I'm hating on Genshin, or vice versa. I'm not, sucking Genshin's dick off that much, to be quite honest, because I do feel like there is still a problem with Genshin Impact's villains, and it stems really from their two main villains, right? The Abyss and the Heavenly Principles, right? Now, before we go and talk about those two in particular, I want to obviously, like I said just a second ago, I want to give a shout out to Genshin for doing some amazing jobs with Reverie and Dottore, right? Because if you look at Reverie as a character, that yes, you could say that they were trying to redeem him at the end. That's not good for a villain, right? And I would agree with you. Yes, him going on the redemption arc would be a bad thing, but I don't think he was necessarily on a redemption arc. He felt remorse, but he was still being punished for his bad deeds, right? He got what he deserved at the end of it all, right? He's stuck in a space of in a space that's basically locked in itself, and a time that's locked in itself. He can sense Tholindis, but he can't go to Tholindis. And same vice versa as well. Tholindis wasn't a great person either, by the way. So both are being punished for, what they had done, of course, during their time in Conrea. Of course, we saw Reverie, of course, doing all the evil he did in Conrea, and that was fantastic, by the way. The way they presented that and all was brilliant. In my personal opinion, that was fantastic from Genshin, and how they handled Reverie as a villain, at least in the beginning and middle part. The end is a very subjective thing. I think a lot of people don't like the fact that, he was feeling remorse and all that sort of jazz, while others felt like, yeah, he felt the remorse, but he was still being punished. So there's always going to be that whole dichotomy and division in terms of how people feel towards Reverie in that situation. But as a villain, as for his actions and, how he was behaving and everything, brilliant. And then Dottore, I mean, we know Dottore was always going to be a fantastic villain. Let's be real. There was no question about that, right? But how they executed him in Nordcry, in my personal opinion, was brilliant. And of course, with how they handled him in dealing with Sumeru and the Irminsul as well, was excellent as well, right? Showed how good he was as a villain, intelligent and just using all of his strengths to his best capabilities, which was fantastic to see, of course, right? Brilliant, absolutely brilliant, right? So Genshin can do a good job with their villains. However, like I said, when it comes to their main two threats, right, the Abyss and the Heavenly Principles, there is still a lot lacking and a lot to be desired when it comes to those two in particular, right? Because while we know, and I'm going to start off with the Abyss in this situation, right? The Abyss, in my personal opinion, is a great presence in Genshin, right? From the start, they've done so much, from, the corruption of Dvalin, to, of course, Enkanomiya and Enjo. We saw him coming into play in some way, shape, or form. The Withering in Sumeru. Then, of course, you could say the abyssal presence of the Narwhal and everything in Fontaine. Then Natlan, the war in Natlan was brilliant. Rerir and the Sinners in Nordcry, and subsequently, of course, what happened after that was still abyssal involvement, right? No matter what anybody says, that was still abyssal involvement in some way, shape, or form. So the Abyss has had a strong presence from the very beginning, but yet there's a problem with the Abyss, and that's the problem is that we still don't have a face to it necessarily, right? There's a bit of a disconnection there necessarily, right? A lot of the Abyss, first and foremost, we primarily face their grunts at the end of the day, right? We face the abyssal creatures, the Hilichurls, the Abyss Mages, the Lectors, the Heralds, and so on and so forth. We don't really face the head honchos of the Abyss necessarily, right? Not to mention, our sibling is leading the Abyss Order. So obviously, a lot of the Abyss is going to be locked, and it remains hidden, because until we get to this sibling, once we end our journey, that's only when we'll really get to start to learn more about the Abyss, right? And then after that, right, we are also then looking at potential abstract motivations, right? You look at a lot of the abyssal orders' reason for destruction and everything is revenge for Khaenri'ah, but we know that the Abyss is far darker and far more sinister in nature, because we know that the Abyss isn't necessarily just originated from Teyvat. The Abyss Order potentially is originated from Teyvat, but the Abyss itself is much darker, much sinister, and comes from much far beyond Teyvat, right? That's something else. And not only that, the Abyss itself is so philosophical and, more natural than, or more distant, I should say, rather than something that's more grounded in the sense, something that's on the ground. You see it physically, you see something, right? Especially with what Alice said, right? The Abyss is originated from the fates that never came to be. It feels it's harder to connect to in some way, shape, or form, right? And not to mention, right now, our main focus is, especially as we head into Snezhnaya, our focus is better, more so on the Harbingers, who are morally great, but you could say that there are still some characters in there that could be considered and potentially are going to be villains, right? And of course, by extension, with what's happening between them and Celestia and the Shades and the Heavenly Principles, our focus is on the other threat, the Heavenly Principles as well, right? That is something to keep in mind. When it comes to the Abyss, that is lacking there. Those are the issues we have with the Abyss right now. Of course, it could all get sorted out towards the end, but right now, it's still hard to connect with the Abyss because of this faceless entity, this philosophical entity that we can't really link to, connect to, or actually figure out in any way, shape, or form, right? I think that was a lot of the problem a lot of people had with Natlan, is that while yes, we had this entire war situation going on with the Abyss, but it felt hard to connect to the Abyss because it was such a faceless entity we were facing. We were just facing a bunch of monsters and abyssal creatures. While yes, that was amazing to see, and how they handled it was great, you could still say, and very correctly so, say that it's hard to connect to because there's no face to the Abyss yet, at least, right? All we know is that our sibling is connected to the Abyss, and obviously that makes it even harder to connect to, because why is our sibling with the Abyss when they have done so much bad? In fact, I think that was the very and to be fair, they did kind of raise this question as well in the story as well, right? In a time and space for you, of course, right? When we were going through that entire story with Diri the Eth and all of that, right? And we met our sibling again, and we were talking about, the Abyss Order, the Loom of Fate, the spaceship key, and everything, right? We were talking about that, and I remember, obviously, as Traveler, obviously, with everything that happened in Natlan very recently, was really grilling the Abyssal sibling as to why they did what they did, and why they linked up with the Abyss when they know they're not good individuals, they're not good beings, right? So there was a little bit of that, at least. And I think Genshin is aware of that, but it doesn't resolve the fact that there is still a slight problem there. And then we come on to the heavenly principles, right? A very similar problem with the heavenly principles is that they are a faceless entity right now, right? Obviously recently we've been getting the shades, and we're getting a little bit more info about what the heavenly principles is truly like, right, with everything that's happened on the moon. And of course we're getting details about potentially the shades also defecting the heavenly principles, right, specifically Asmodee, right? So obviously we're getting more and more information about the heavenly principles, but once upon a time ago they also were just a very, very unknown entity, very hard to connect to because we knew very little about them. All we knew is that they dropped these celestial nails on places, caused a lot of destruction, destroyed civilizations, in particular the dragon civilization. And so of course it was difficult for us to fully understand what the heavenly principles was truly like. Of course that's getting better and better with time, and it's why I say now that Genshin only has a slight problem with their villains, and in particular it's because their Genshin is actively trying to improve and give us a better understanding and insight on these villains, right? That being said, though, again, one of the other issues that we have with the heavenly principles, and I think this is a good thing, by the way, right? Because it obviously leads to more debate, more discussions, right? And that is, of course, the heavenly principles' idea of what's right and wrong, right? Obviously you could say that they're playing a very harsh role, a very big brother like role, you could say, right, with how they've treated all the civilizations. For even the most minor of discretions, they would just absolutely destroy them, punish them massively, right, with what they did with Koitar and the Voyager and all the stuff in between, right, with the dragons and everything, right? I think you could easily say it is very harsh, very wrong, and you could say it's evil, right? But you could also argue and say that, well, what they did was for the benefit of the planet, right? At the end of the day, they came into Teyvat because the universe out there is dying. We know that there is a dark presence out there, linked to the Abyss in some way, shape, or form. The star devouring darkness, either it's the Abyss, connected to the Abyss, the origin of the Abyss, we don't know yet, right? We know that there's something out there that's this big, massive threat, and we know very little of, right? But the heavenly principles came to Teyvat to run away from that, to set up their to set up humanity on Teyvat, to use Teyvat as a home for their people, basically, right? And you could say that what they did was for the greater good. Obviously that is subjective, again, like I said, very subjective, very much a case for debate more so than anything else. But you could still say that in their endeavor to obviously bring a lot of good to the planet and to try and protect the planet, they had to do a lot of evil, necessary evil, you could say, right? I would still say that constitutes them as a villain. I'm sorry, but that is villainous behavior nonetheless, right? You could be doing it for what you think is the right reasons, but you are leading to, the cleansing of entire civilizations. You have, destroyed lives, people's families. Everything you've done has led to effectively a very different Teyvat to what could have been, of course, right, from way back when. So that's something to keep in mind. So for me, when we come back to the main topic at hand, does Genshin have a villain problem? As we go into Snezhnaya, I think this villain problem is becoming lesser and lesser and lesser, right? And who would have thunk it? With time, this problem was going to become a non-factor, right? I remember so many people, like I said, earlier on, once upon a time ago, I think around the time of Fontaine, maybe Sumeru, right? Genshin, the community was always saying that Genshin had a villain problem. They didn't have good villains. Genshin was struggling with villains, and then subsequently, with games like Honkai Star Rail and everything coming out and having really good villains. Let's not get it twisted, right? I'm not going to even, give very little credit for what is actually supposed to be given a lot of credit for. when you look at Ligus and Asad Pramad, they're fantastic villains, absolutely, right? And it was a bit of a shame that, of course, Genshin never got that until recently, you could say, with Dottore and Rerir, right? Obviously, La Signora was very much a minimal factor, right? Because, of course, we managed to get through her in basically a patch, basically, right? Because we didn't really encounter her throughout Mondstadt until the end. Leeway, we again met her only at the end. Only in Azuma was she a bigger factor, and then we obviously faced her and everything. Scaramouche was there for one patch, and then he was redeemed. Azar was put back in jail, so that was done and dusted. Dottore, of course, came back in Nordcry, and we had a fantastic arc with him. Rerir, again, fantastic arc with him as well. But when we look at the main two villains, the main villains that we're supposed to be concerning ourselves with, right, the Abyss and the Heavenly Principles, it felt like we were not getting enough about them. And with Natlan and Nordcry, I do believe that the main issue that we have with the Abyss and with the Heavenly Principles, which is mainly surrounding the lack of information, the lack of connection we have with them, it's become more of a non-issue since then, to be honest. We were getting more answers, we're getting more of an understanding, we're building that connection up with these villains. And I believe, honestly, by the end of Snezhnaya and going into whatever is happening next year, right, I think this problem is going to become a non-factor. And I know I can't end this video without talking about the last faction that we thought was going to be a villainous faction since the start of the game, but as time has gone on, it's been more and more difficult to really judge where they're going to place, and more likely than not, they're probably going to end up on our side more so than anything else. So on the side of the protagonists, on the side of the heroes, and that is of course the Fatui Harbingers, right? We know that they had some people in the organization who obviously were on the wrong side of the coin, of course the likes of Dottore. La Signora's methods, of course, made her significantly on the side of being a villain, of course, right? And you have Pantalone as well, whose morals and attitude is really questionable as well. Pulcinella also, to add on to that. And then if you look at the likes of Arlecchino, Sandrone, and so on and so forth, they're all very morally gray as well. So it's difficult to really say that they're, heroes per se, but at the same time, if you look at their organization and with the way some of them behave and some of their plans of action as well as their end goals, it doesn't feel like they're necessarily villains. They're more so people who use any means necessary to get the plan across the border. And of course, outside of Dottore was as evil as it could come. But when it comes to the rest of them, it feels like the means are irrelevant. As long as it achieves the goal that they want, they'll do anything. And so for me, I feel like the Fatui Harbingers, and I feel like you could say that this is a problem. I feel like it's just a case of we needed time to develop their story, to be honest. Of course, with Winter Knight's Lazo and our first look at Signora and how she behaved, as well as Scaramouche, Dottore, a majority of the Fatui Harbingers outside of Tartaglia went in the first 3 or 4 regions basically were dickheads, effectively, right? They were as evil as they could come. But then with Arlecchino getting a better insight into her, of course Capitano, and now Sandrone, Colombina, and of course we know Tartaglia for so long, it feels like there's like two sides of the coin when it comes to the Fatui Harbingers. Some that are just doing anything to achieve their goals, and then some who obviously are caring about the means a little bit, but still are going to want to do what they can to achieve their goals. So it's very difficult to say where they lie. I know majority of the players wanted them to be full-blown evil. Do I think it's a problem? This one, I'm not so sure. I personally think it's good to see a morally gray faction in this situation, right? A faction that we're going to probably need the help of in order to achieve our goals as well, right? And achieve our end destination. So I personally feel like having a faction the faction be the Fatui Harbingers, I think it makes sense. I think it makes a lot of sense, because I didn't see, in the lead up to, of course, Snezhnaya, there being anything else. It's the final region. Why not make the Fatui Harbingers be that faction that we'd have to maybe, shake hands with at the end of it all to, maybe do some morally gray stuff to potentially achieve the end result of, finally meeting the heavenly principles, finally getting to, the underneath of the entire story and get an idea of what is exactly happening. But let me know what you guys think. With the Abyss Order, or the Abyss in general, I should say, the heavenly principles, and of course what I mentioned about the Fatui Harbingers towards the end there. What do you guys think? Does Genshin still have a villain problem, or have they improved from, when they began? Or do you think they never had a problem in the first place? I'm curious to see where you all place your opinion on in this matter. I feel like it's going to be very interesting. For me, I still think they do have a slight problem, but I think, come the end of Snezhnaya, I think the way they're progressing, and I think the way they've executed the story over the last 2 years, I would say, I'm going to include Natlan in that, because I really do think they did a good job with Natlan in progressing the story, especially when it came to the villains. I think they're on track to do a great job and progress it even further come Snezhnaya. So let's see how it all pans out. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's not improved at all and my opinions change. Or maybe it was never a problem at all and they've done the right thing in the build-up. Let's see how it all pans out. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Take it easy, everybody. Bye-bye.